Scattered across this nation, there are places abandoned, boarded up, mysterious. I will unlock their doors and make them yield their secrets. From a people's palace of dreams that brought glamour and hope, to a military hospital that was the birthplace of plastic surgery.
That's a magnificent piece of work.
It is a lovely thing.
This defies all preconceptions and prejudices.
He'd never done that operation before.
Firing. To a vast Soviet war machine that brought us to the brink of World War III. Submarine warfare is hide and seek. I've realized today how chillingly close we were to annihilation. To a vast Victorian citadel of heroes. The size of it.
A coroner's court. You've got the authorities, you've got the mob. Where's the fire brigade?
In the middle. They've always been in the middle.
This will be my hidden history of Britain. In this programme, I go in search of the lost age of the British seaside.
You weren't in the sea, but you were on the sea.
A town built for fun. Men and women bathing together. Very saucy, very continental.
The numbers of seating for spectators was always much bigger than for the swimmers themselves because of the flesh that was now on show.
The stabbing of Boris, a fantasy. With a dark underbelly. Some kind of vision of hell. I don't even want to touch it. And in the centre of it all, a moment that would devastate a family.
I remember looking into his eyes and seeing something of him that meant he wasn't just the man who killed my dad.
Nowhere in Britain is more than 75 miles from the sea. From the sea have come wealth, power, and new ideas from across the globe. And seaside towns like Brighton are where we go when we want to throw off the straitjacket of everyday life, where we go to escape. I want to uncover the hidden history of the Great British Holiday Resort, and I'm starting my search at the skeletal remains of one of the most iconic seaside attractions in British history. Britain's coastline is studded with piers, some working, some ruins, all of them relics of the British traditional holiday. The West Pier at Brighton was one of the most popular. It stretched 340 metres, and 3,000 people at a time, the sort who would probably never have the chance to put to sea, could enjoy the magical experience of walking on water. But this is all that is left of it now. Cities like Athens and Rome are defined by their ruins, and since the fire at the West Pier, this ghostly hulk has also been a key part of Brighton's waterfront. But whereas ancient ruins are stabilised against further decay, the West Pier lives on borrowed time. Sooner or later, it will tumble into the sea. Thank you. I want to have a better look at this celebrated wreck, and the only way I can get really close is in a smaller boat. The ruins of this great structure still sit on steel supports that were screwed into the seabed well over a century ago. Defying the waters and the elements, the West Pier survives, a testimony to the extraordinary strength of Victorian engineering. It's certainly an impressive wreck, and like all ruins, you have to be very respectful of it. It's quite dangerous if you're not careful. Here, for example, just in front of our little boat, there are two spikes sticking up. If we go over them, we would hold the boat, undoubtedly. And let's see whether we can pick our way through the ruins. Nature is reclaiming the pier. There are great knots here of mussels and barnacles. And you could probably once have heard the band playing, but now the only sound is the cries of seagulls. Another way in which nature is reclaiming the pier. Here we are at the very heart of the pier. Having promenaded this far, you would here have enjoyed entertainments, music, dancing. It's all eerily silent now, and the walkways now end in mid-air. It's a century and a half since this grand old pier was built, but how much longer can it endure? Marine engineer John Orrell has been monitoring the ruins for the last 2 decades. Have you any idea, can you estimate how long it may last until the whole thing has disappeared?
Well, I think there'll always be something there if it's just left. But I would say another 20 years and it won't be recognisable as a pier.
To me, it's quite remarkable that so much remains, given what it's been through. Do you think it was pretty well built?
It was very well built, yes. Really thick cast iron sections. And even today in the North Sea, we use cast iron as a great durable material. The Victorians really knew how to build robustly.
Was the pier a quintessentially British thing?
Very much so. I don't think there's any country in the world that has anywhere near the amount of piers that there is in the UK. In the heyday of the pier, there was something over 200, and now I think there's about 80 left.
Why did piers become such a British institution? Historian Jackie Marsh has investigated the love affair between Britain and its pleasure piers.
Oscar Wilde said about pleasure piers, you have the pleasure of a sea cruise, but none of the peril.
How was it decided to build the West Pier here at Brighton?
So it was local businessmen got together to build a pier as a seaside resort to draw people here. They would get an Act of Parliament to allow them to build out over the beach and then into the sea and set up a company and sell the shares.
What did the West Pier offer?
So Eugenius Birch, who was a fantastic architect who was responsible for the West Pier and actually 14 pleasure piers that he designed, and it was a pier for you to promenade on. You had ramps either side so that bath chairs could have access, and then you'd have lots of seating all the way around the outside, so you can watch people promenade up and down the actual pier and look out to sea at the same time.
Here I am propped up against the last rusty remains of the old West Pier. But here's a picture of it in its heyday, probably at the turn of the Victorian period into the Edwardian. And everything about the pier was elegant from the moment you entered this beautiful kiosk to buy your ticket, and then you promenaded across the sea, which would have been a most unusual experience for many people. At the end, you would have reached this lovely auditorium where you could have heard a concert or maybe seen a play. And the pleasure craft were here to take the Intrepid out over the waters to enjoy the sea. Britain has lost quite a lot of its piers to arson and to vandalism, and it really is a shame because they were beautiful structures and they were part of the personality of Brighton and part of the personality of Britain. These photographs and the old ruins have given me an intriguing glimpse of a lost world when holidaying on our coast was a national obsession. But the early days of Brighton were characterised by tears as much as by laughter.
Brighton had severe outbreaks of cholera, typhus, scarlet fever. It is one of the worst towns in Britain for it.
I'm uncovering the hidden history of the British seaside resort. I've explored the ruins of one of Britain's most revered tourist attractions, Brighton's West Pier. But what was it like actually to set foot there in its heyday?
The West Pier was the pier as far as I was concerned. There was something about it. There was a welcoming feeling. As soon as I trod on those boards, you were perfectly dry, but you were at sea.
102-year-old Len Goldman moved to Brighton in 1920. He's one of the very last living witnesses to a golden age of the British seaside resort, when the West Pier attracted 2 million visitors every year. What do you remember of the West Pier?
I think I can call it my second home. I went on it as often as I possibly could. It had a fascination. It had a certain atmosphere. It drew me. I couldn't always afford it. It cost sixpence, 6 old pence to get in half price for children. As soon as you got on the pier, you began to feel a certain freedom. You weren't in the sea, but you were on the sea. And you walked along, you had this very narrow part with a glass partition down the centre, deck chairs on either side and people sitting there. Then you came to the first bulge, which was a dance hall. After that, there was the theatre. But beyond that, you got the diving pool. There was this Amazonian lady came there, shouting through a loud hailer, "Any more for the diving in the bay at the end of the pier?" They came round with a collecting box, which of course we kids ignored. And she stood up there, and then she did some dives which would not disgrace an Olympic diver.
Really?
It's a very high board, somersaults, all the stuff.
When you were a youngster, what were you wearing to bathe?
Well, you were not allowed to go bare-topped, even men. And eventually, I got the prize swimsuit, the Jansen. And it had great big holes at the side.
Ooh.
So you were exposed as much as you possibly could legally.
I associate piers with old people. But back in the 1920s, this one inspired love in the young Len, a passion which has endured into his 102nd year.
For generations of British men, women and children, the seaside was the ultimate escape from the struggle of day-to-day life. But how did a small fishing village like Brighton become such a magnet for British holidaymakers?
I love walking along Brighton Beach. If you close your eyes and walk, you've got the water lapping at the stones, you've got the cry of the seagulls, and then you open your eyes and you're on the seashore of a large city full of people enjoying themselves.
Social geographer Geoffrey Mead has delved into the origins of Britain's first great seaside resort.
Jeff, how does Brighton move from being a fishing village to some kind of resort?
Well, it's a changing economy. The town was a rather prosperous coastal trading and fishing town. The big beach, the beach disappears with coastal erosion. People move away. It's a depressed economy. And nearby in Lewes, Dr. Richard Russell, who's a famous physician of the time, starts to direct people down to property he owns on the coast to the new simple life that you have in Brighthelmstone.
What is it meant to do that's good for your health?
It's getting away from London. London is the most polluted spot on earth. When you come down to the seaside, you're dipped in the sea, you get a wash, which not many 18th century rich people did. You're given seawater to drink, either neat or mixed with rum or porter, or excruciatingly badly with milk. Of course, it's an emetic, and with a diet that the very rich had at the time, too much rich food, alcohol, making you sick is very good. You go back and people will say, "Michael, you look exceedingly well. I've been to Brighthelmstone." That's how it starts.
So if I'd stepped out in the early 19th century in Brighton, what might I have seen?
Immense amount of elegance at this end of town. The seafront would have been packed with people. Something we don't do anymore in the 21st century is promenading. You dress up to see and be seen. You didn't come to a seaside resort to skulk away in your room. You came out to be seen with the best in the land. And of course, when we were a royal town, when the royal family were in residence and all of the royal court was here, you couldn't get any higher in society than being seen out in the company of the royal family, for instance. And so it had all that added cachet to it.
George, the Prince of Wales, was famous for his enjoyment of rich food and wine. When he started coming here in the 1780s to take the sea cure, Brighton's reputation as Britain's premier health resort was secured. A seaside holiday became the thing to do. Jane Austen wrote, "The sea air was healing, softening, relaxing. If the sea breeze failed, the sea bath was the certain corrective." But there was a strict etiquette to be followed. Mixed bathing, men and women swimming alongside each other, was frowned upon. Bathing costumes were yet to be devised. So they invented a bathing machine, a kind of beach hut on wheels that delivered bathers into the water, modesty intact. But is the sea dip really the cure-all that the Georgians believed it to be? The Brighton Swimming Club is the oldest in the country, and they've invited me to join them for their morning constitutional. The water's about 9 degrees Celsius. I feel a bit of a wimp. They're just in their normal bathing suits. I am in a wetsuit. I've been advised that even in my wetsuit, to withstand the cold, I need to take a number of deep breaths. Wait for me! Oh my God! Like previous generations who came here, these swimmers believe that immersing yourself in cold sea water can cure all sorts of ailments from epilepsy to arthritis. And originally Brighton was more popular in winter than in summer.
Now, although I'm wearing a wetsuit which has my body well protected, my feet and my hands are not. And so the cold at my extremes is intense. And I could tell from the people around me that they are really suffering from the cold, but my goodness, they're doing it voluntarily. And some of them have now gone a very long distance out towards the end of the Palace Pier. Brave, brave people. So why do you go in this very cold water?
Stick.
Yes.
I've got arthritis. It's affecting my spine and neck, and cold water relieves the pain. And above all, it gives exercise. So I'm exerting my body.
And does that give you more mobility when you emerge from the water?
Oh, certainly. I've got about half an hour, which is comfortable. Gets me home.
Did you stumble on that remedy?
No, it was sort of handed down through the family.
For how long now have you club members been going down this beach in the morning?
This beach was where it all started, because this was the gentlemen's bathing beach. Don't forget, bathing was segregated. Gentlemen here, ladies to the west.
Well, life is full of surprises. What I thought was just an exercise in getting extremely cold turns out to have physical benefits, and even more surprisingly, mental health benefits for many of these people. I'm really quite tempted to rip off my wetsuit and do it properly. I might leave that for Monday.
The seaside cure drew a wealthy elite to coastal towns like Brighton. But the Industrial Revolution would utterly transform seaside resorts all over Britain. In 1841, the railway came to Brighton. A long and uncomfortable coach journey from London was slashed to a mere 1 hour and 45 minutes on the train. Suddenly, visitor numbers rocketed as the middle and working classes flocked to Brighton. In just 6 months, almost 400,000 arrived by train. Within a year, Britain's most celebrated health retreat was overflowing with effluent and disease.
As Brighton grows in popularity, what happens to the waste matter?
There's no provision for sewage disposal. They're relying on the fact that Brighton's built on a chalk landscape. They dig a hole in the chalk, pour liquid into it, the liquid disappears. The lovely descriptions in the 1849 Mr. Creasy's health report of a street with 55 houses, 2 cesspits, which never require emptying, which isn't a major problem until you realise they're on a steep hill, and the next street down has its well immediately below that. And below that is another street with stables, and below that is another well. And so the entire water table is heavily polluted.
And some of it presumably ends up in the sea as well.
Some of it ends up in the sea from the classier end of town, which has sewers, which then go down into the Central Valley, and that's pumped out straight onto the central Brighton beaches.
Does Brighton then suffer from its fair share of cholera and so on?
It is one of the worst towns in Britain for it. Authorities are very good at covering up the fact that Dr. Brighton had severe outbreaks of cholera in the 1840s, typhus, scarlet fever. There were some horrendous tales.
Brighton boomed on the idea of good health. Its sea water and sea breezes attracted visitors from foul-aired industrial cities. But when its cesspits overflowed, and when disease stalked its streets, that was a reputational disaster. Brighton had to dig deep. Why on earth would they build somewhere this big? Some kind of vision of hell. I don't even want to touch it.
I'm uncovering the hidden history of the British seaside resort. I've discovered how Victorian engineering brought the masses to the seaside at Brighton and helped them to enjoy it. But I've also found out how rapid growth brought deadly disease to a town built on improving people's health.
During the 19th century, 2 towns were built at Brighton. One above ground of creamy facades, the other beneath of finely built brick sewers, each magnificent in its way, a tale of 2 cities, affluence and effluence. On such a lovely sunny day in Brighton, it seems a pity to leave behind this pretty square and descend into a world of clammy darkness. But duty calls.
I know that hidden away down here, I'll find the Victorian answer to Brighton's disastrous health crisis. Following major outbreaks of cholera in Brighton's slums and a campaign by the medical journal The Lancet, an institution was created by Act of Parliament to build the town's sewers.
This pipe is deeply encrusted and covered in goo. It's some kind of vision of hell. I don't even want to touch it. And here, the roots of plants are coming through the earth and penetrating the sewer. And the little tips of those roots are hanging down here. And they've got encrusted with some kind of white gunge. The whole place is humid and nasty.
In just 9 years, Brighton spent over £100,000, a vast sum of money at the time, building an elaborate underground network of sewers to service Britain's most popular seaside resort.
Here and there are escape hatches to that other Brighton. I could pop out here like a rabbit emerging from a hole. I'd no idea where I would be. And everything is encrusted with salts and minerals which have accrued over a very long time of drippiness.
Millions of tons of earth had to be excavated, and 7 million bricks meticulously laid to construct this labyrinth of tunnels.
A vast space. Superb brickwork in these extraordinary vaulted ceilings. Behind me, 2 tunnels. And behind this wall, a huge sound of water, rushing water. Why would they need a space this big?
Engineer Stuart Slake keeps the 150-year-old tunnels in working order.
Hello. You would be Stuart, I assume.
Good afternoon, Michael. How are you?
Very good to see you.
And you?
This enormous space. Why on earth would they build somewhere this big?
The Victorians always thought big and they built large. And this tank that we're in now is an overflow chamber. On the right-hand side over there where I'm shining with the torches there, the other side of that wall is a foul sewer coming down 2 foot. And where we're standing here, we're standing in the overflow part itself. And what happens is we have heavy rain. It'll come down that foul sewer, which is a combined sewer. The heavy rain will come in with that, mix in it, come over that wall where we're standing, and then it will go back down the barrels behind me.
How filled have you seen this in our lifetimes?
I've seen this filled about halfway. If you stand where that pipe is there on the outlet, I've been on top of that, and the second pipe up, literally, it's been that high right the way through.
So obviously over the wall and all this part filled up as well.
Yeah.
How extensive is the sewer system here in Brighton?
We can go around about 44 miles of the sewer system by boat or walk around the system. But there's so many arteries and veins and lead-offs to this under the old part of Brighton as well.
So actually it's quite difficult to know the entire thing, is it? Just as it would be difficult to know a city.
Oh yes, exactly. It's a very good underground city too. I don't know how they ever managed to do this because, like, to get everything precise. This is the incredible thing about this.
It's an engineering achievement every bit the equal of the Victorians' marvellous railways.
This safety tunnel, like the sewers themselves, twists and turns. Of course, I've no idea where I am under the city. I could be under some of the most fashionable squares and terraces. And then the funny thing is that they were built with beautiful facades, but behind that they were often jerry-built, whereas the sewers, now they had to be built with the finest Victorian engineering. So there's a paradox that the underground city is better constructed than the one we all know up top.
The sewers were built so well that 150 years later they still provide the backbone of Brighton's sewerage system. 30 years of Victorian ingenuity gave Brighton the railway, the West Pier, luxurious hotels and the sewers. The stage was now set for the golden age of the bucket and spade holiday and all that came with it, from fish and chips to donkey rides, to one of Britain's most popular entertainers.
Mr. Punch is basically an Italian immigrant made good. He's somehow tapped into the English love of authority being poked fun at in a safe way by someone else, because if they do it, they might get into trouble.
Glyn Edwards has been performing Punch and Judy shows for most of his life, but Punch has been entertaining British holidaymakers for almost 2 centuries.
I'm coming up there for you. Nee-naw, nee-naw, nee-naw. Right, now then, ow. You've been a naughty boy, I'm going to take you to jail. You come with me when I count 3. A 1, a 2.
When did you first see Punch and Judy?
Ooh, I saw it in about 1950, about 300 yards from where we're now standing, under the West Pier.
What is the origin?
Well, Punch goes back to 1662, although the puppet was then called Polichinelli. But round about to the late Industrial Revolution times, he becomes Punch. And when railways come to the seaside, the street entertainers bring Punch to the seaside, and he kind of becomes the iconic seaside entertainer.
So, has Punch and Judy been important to Brighton in particular?
It's more that Brighton's been important to Punch and Judy in the sense that it helped shape the current way that Punch and Judy is seen as a seaside entertainment. And because Brighton was the premier, largest, first ever, whatever, best seaside resort, Punch and Judy sort of picked up on its popularity, and in turn Brighton helped embed Mr. Punch as the seaside anti-hero.
Punch and Judy was a safe way to throw off the chains of daily life for a short while, with its satirical attack on marriage, parenthood, the law, and even politicians. I'm going to perform a little play of my own, and I've given it a title that Punch, with his mischievous, hard-hitting satire, would have appreciated.
Michael Portillo Productions present The Stabbing of Boris, a fantasy. Hello? Oh, cripes. Oh, crikey. Oh, cripes. Cripes. I'm the Foreign Secretary. Cripes. My name's Boris. Oh, crikey. Yes, right. Boris. Whole world doesn't think it's all that funny. Cripes. Hello. What's happened here then?
What's that? He's mad.
A foreign secretary. Stabbed in the back. Look for Michael Gove!
With my somewhat exotic background, I'm intrigued to learn that Mr. Punch was an Italian immigrant. For across the sea, have come to this island nation many of its most important influences. I've now moved to the edge of Brighton to uncover another hidden seaside story. This is the Saltdean Lido, built in 1937.
This building was constructed a little more than 70 years after the West Pier, and what a difference a few decades make. It could not be more different. Here the lines are bold and clean, and it's inspired by the architecture of an ocean liner. It's been more fortunate than the West Pier, it's not suffered a fire. But my goodness, it's pretty derelict.
The plan is to restore this Art Deco building and bring it back to its original glamour. The first phase, the pool, is complete.
You say Lido and I say Lido. I think it should be Lido because it's named after the Lido in Venice, and this was all part of a foreign influence on Britain. Men and women bathing together, revealing swimwear, bronzed skins. Very saucy, very continental.
The Lido reflects a changed Britain. We'd lived through the horrors of the First World War and thrown off staid traditions during the Roaring '20s. I want to know how this changed the British seaside.
Architecture at the seaside is very much about giving people some glamour on their holidays. It's all bright, white, shiny, clean lines, like nothing you've ever really seen before. And what an amazing place to have a swim.
Historian Catherine Ferry specialises in British seaside architecture.
By the time we get to the 1930s, are men and women showing a bit more flesh?
Absolutely, yes. Yeah, flesh is very much on show. And actually it's very interesting in buildings like this that they catered for more spectators than swimmers, usually. So there are these massive Lidos all around the coast, and the number of seating for spectators was always much bigger than for the swimmers themselves because of the flesh that was now on show.
I'm wondering how we get from that position in the late 19th century, where the genders were on the beach bathing separately and covered up to here, to what I assume was mixed bathing and people taking the sun.
People have been going abroad for their holidays and they've seen that actually nothing terrible happens when men and women bathe together. There starts to be a newspaper campaign. The most go-ahead resorts start allowing mixed bathing, and that sort of starts in the 1890s, 1900s. It picks up pace. The big change to where we are now happens in the interwar period. It happens because of the fashion for sunbathing, because this is the new health cure. You used to have the sea bathing in the 18th century that was supposed to be the cure-all. Now it's sunshine.
Now, Victorians feared that if you had people bathing together, mixing the genders, and if you allowed flesh to be shown, that this would lead to immorality. What do you think happened when this actually occurred in the 1930s?
I think everybody actually had some fun at last. I think that actually, when you look back at the Victorians, they weren't quite as dour as we paint them. But I think by the 1930s, we finally discovered some fun. So sad that it all came to such an abrupt halt with the outbreak of war.
Oh, really? What happened then?
Well, Saltdean Lido, like all of the other Lidos around the coast, ceased to operate. Holiday camps were taken over by the forces as training grounds. So that whole seaside resort culture ceased to be for 5 years.
Like many seaside towns across the country, Brighton became the front line of the nation's defences during the Second World War. But after the war, British seaside resorts bounced back to life. In 1949, 5 million holidaymakers strolled and sunned themselves on Britain's pleasure piers as families made their annual pilgrimage to Brighton, Blackpool, Cleethorpes and Skegness. Picnics, rock pooling and ice creams were the order of the day.
Did anyone ever have a week-long British seaside holiday with perfect weather? I very much doubt it. You had to retreat behind the rain-stained windows of the local Greasy Spoon Cafe, or here on the beach, fight a stiff easterly breeze, putting up your windbreaker.
Brighton would eventually reinvent itself as one of the most stylish seaside resorts in Europe. But first, it would endure some of its darkest ever days.
I left here and went to the hotel where I was staying. An hour later, the bomb went off.
The Grand for me is the hotel where my dad was killed.
This is my hidden history of the British seaside resort. By the 1960s, package holidays transformed our seaside towns. Millions of us turned our backs on seaside B&Bs, crowded roads, rainy summers and cold seas to travel to exotic, sunny locations. But the traditional British resorts, like Brighton and Blackpool, managed to attract a new political clientele.
At the time of the Conservative Party conference of 1984, I was working for the Chancellor of the Exchequer. And here in the bar of the Grand Hotel, I got involved in a row about economic policy with the journalist. I was fed up with the row and I left here and went to the hotel where I was staying. An hour later, the bomb went off. And because I'd become disgusted by the row and left, perhaps that had saved my life.
Some of my friends and colleagues weren't so lucky. At 2:54 a.m. on the 12th of October 1984, an IRA bomb tore through Brighton's Grand Hotel. Its target was Margaret Thatcher and her cabinet.
The Grand for me is the hotel where my dad was killed. It's always going to be a sort of a powerful thing for me to come back here because it brings back all the memories.
That night, Jo Berry lost her father, Conservative MP Sir Anthony Berry.
How did you feel in the aftermath of your father's death?
Just so shocked and couldn't believe it. And then the pain came. And when the pain came, it was very overwhelming. This was life-changing in many, many ways. You know, I knew I couldn't go back to the person I had been. And I thought, I have to bring something positive out of this.
So quickly you thought that?
Yeah. And so that sort of set a direction of I want to bring something peaceful out of this violence. But of course I had no idea how to do that.
How did it come about then, that in the end the direction was that you would meet your father's killer?
I wanted to build a bridge with him. I wanted to see him as a human being rather than a sort of faceless enemy. Not to change him, but for my own healing. So I listened a lot, and I reached a point where I'd seen that he was someone who, he cared for his community. He was a deep thinker, got a PhD in prison. And I remember looking into his eyes and seeing something of him that meant he wasn't just the man who killed my dad. I shared how wonderful my dad had been. And what happened to Patrick was that he reached a point where he just stopped talking and looked at me and he said, I don't know who I am anymore. And it was the beginning of him understanding the impact of what he'd done. Because when he planted that bomb, he didn't, in this hotel, I can't believe we're here, he didn't see any human beings. He completely demonized everyone. So I said, thank you, I'm going to go now. And he said, I'm really sorry I killed your dad. And what that meant to me was his awareness that he'd actually killed a wonderful human being.
You've done a number of public events together.
Did I know which hotel our dad and our stepmother Sarah were staying at? And I said, I think it's the Grand Hotel. And about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, we had the phone call to say that they found his body. But I decided to go ahead and go public because I thought, with the peace process still in very early stages, if this can bring more peace to Northern Ireland, then it's worth it. If it means that less people are going to be hurt, we can't change the past. Nothing's going to bring my dad back and the others. So it's about creating a different future for my children and their children.
When I first heard that you'd done this, it struck me as something very extraordinary, and I'm afraid I don't mean that in a positive way. I thought it was a very odd thing to do. I couldn't understand it. And with the passage of time and the way you explain it, I now completely understand it. So I think, yes. So I think, the rest of us have been on a journey as well.
Wow. Well, it's really moving to hear. And I know it's challenging and I know people find it hard because it is sort of going against sort of the normal way of doing things. It hasn't been easy and still isn't necessarily easy. But it's something that I feel, if I can do that, then, if my dad was here, he would say he understood and be proud of me, and yeah.
I guess he would.
Yeah.
The Grand Hotel was one of the landmarks of Brighton's Victorian heyday, and firemen claim that many lives were saved because it was so well built. But Brighton's status as Britain's premier resort would come under threat again. In the spring of 2003, a series of fires swept through the West Pier, destroying one of our greatest seaside attractions. The destruction marked a low point in the history of Brighton, but something new and exciting has risen from the ashes.
I've come out into a sort of central courtyard into which the donut descends, and you get the most extraordinary idea of the height of the pillar here. And I love the fact that the donut is shiny, and so I can see Brighton reflected in it. I can see the beach, I can see the waves, I can see the traffic. This is so lovely. The whole structure, of course, has to be bedded in the chalk, and the architects have left it exposed. This is Brighton Rock. This is magnificent. It's a cable wound around a drum. It's not rocket science, it's simple engineering, but so beautifully executed. But like the Victorians who built the West Pier, it's been done with love, with pride and attention to detail, and the scale is deeply impressive.
Architect Julia Barfield designed the I-360 with her husband, David Marks.
Julia, the very first thing we see from this particular perspective is the West Pier.
Absolutely.
How important was that pier as part of your inspiration and, if I may say, responsibility?
Absolutely. Well, it's the reason we're here. We're like a vertical pier, really. Piers in their day were all about sort of walking on water, and if you like, we're walking on air. They're about going out to the sea and looking back at Brighton, and we're doing it in a very kind of 21st century way, I suppose.
That's right. I mean, I love the pace of this.
Yes.
It is as though we were walking. I can imagine we're walking along the pier, but actually we're going vertically.
Yes, it's a 21st century, hopefully, answer to that kind of innovation of the late 19th century.
And today, a sunny day, unfortunately, a bit hazy nonetheless.
In my hidden history of the British seaside resort, I've discovered how Brighton began as a health retreat.
I've got arthritis. It's affecting my spine and neck, and cold water relieves the pain.
And was transformed into a mass tourist destination.
I think I can call it my second home. I went on it as often as I possibly could.
And saved by the creation of a slimy underworld.
Of course, I've no idea where I am under the city.
It was a conduit for new foreign ideas.
Punch is really a kind of clown. Commedia dell'arte descending.
Where we could be free.
I think everybody actually had some fun at last.
Royal Brighton was the model for seaside resorts. A uniquely British blend of glamour and grime, of elegance and irreverence. On the West Pier, the toffs in all their finery, promenading above the brine, might be outraged by unruly lads. The sea gave this town its life, and now the waters have reclaimed that pier, hiding its holiday history beneath the waves forever.